Now, both of those propositions are just utterly wrong. And Rashid mentioned the Israeli archaeologist Gideon Suleimani. And I have his affidavit here, and you'll see it on the websites. And a couple of the amazing points. First, he was the director for antiquities of the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem from 2000 to 2005. And when he took the entrepreneurs, as he called them, the people who were going to build the Simon Wiesenthal Center to the site, he said that it was a very ancient Muslim cemetery where no archaeological excavations had ever been made, and he knew nothing of the state of the graves. But he added that it is possible to see graves adjacent to the fence I'm speaking about, the 25-foot one, of the parking lot, and both inside and outside the parking lot. In other words, the graves went under the fence. He also said that the entire area, as he put it, abounded with graves, and that under the parking lot there was a crowded Muslim cemetery containing 3 or 4 layers. Then he said the discovery didn't surprise him. The cemetery is known in antiquities as the burial site in Jerusalem. It was a burial site ever since the Crusades, the 12th century, etc. He goes on, the language that Rashid quoted, to call the rush that the Israeli Antiquities Authorities put on him and what they were making him do to get in and out of that cemetery as quickly as possible. He calls that an archaeological crime. This is an affidavit submitted to the court. Then he says, when he concludes, a total of 250 skeletons were excavated. He was allowed to excavate for a certain period of time. Of course, even that excavation, even though he comes out on our side on this, that excavation was done without any Muslim authorities. It was done by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and we don't know what happened to those 250 sets of bones. He said, in addition, there were 200 graves that he had time to expose, but did not excavate. And on the basis of that, he estimated there were at least 2,000 graves on the Simon Wiesenthal Center site. And then he says, when he talks about the Supreme Court, I was amazed to know that the Antiquities Authority had notified the Supreme Court that, quote, almost the entire area of the excavation has been released for construction because it contains no further scientific data. This is a factual archaeological lie. Then he talks about burials of Muslims and Jews. We discovered hundreds of Muslim graves on the site. The position in which the skeletons were lying on their sides and facing Mecca testifies that this is indeed a Muslim environment. In parentheses, I shall state that if the skeletons in question were Jewish, the story would have developed in a completely different direction. When the skeletons found are suspected to be Jewish, it is mandatory to notify the Ministry of Religion and its representatives may discontinue the excavation. It appears to me that the Muslim dead have nobody to defend them. Understand, this is by a Jewish archaeologist. And you know, I was reading, I don't know if you saw the paper the other day about a few bones, maybe half a dozen found, at a site of the Israelis are planning to build an emergency room outside of Ashkelon onto a hospital. I don't know, there's half a dozen bones or 10 bones. And they couldn't decide whether they were Jewish bones or non-Jewish bones. And the way it's referred to in some of the articles, are these Jewish bones, are they pagan bones? Are they Jewish bones, or in the worst of the sites, are they Goyim bones, the Yiddish word for non-Jews? That's the way they refer to them, and of course, if they're Jewish bones, then they have a problem. Then they're going to have trouble building the emergency room. If they're, quote, pagan bones, then they can go ahead with the building. And it's a huge fight in Israel. If they're Jewish bones, a whole different story. The government has a problem. If it wants to build the hospital, the Orthodox Jews won't let it happen. But the difference in treatment, say it's striking, is to put it mildly. The archaeologist goes on. The earliest headstone that he found was from 1278, and the latest was from the 1930s. He concludes that he must say he read the judgment of the Supreme Court in a state of shock. The position of the Antiquities Authority, on whose behalf I was in charge of conducting the investigation, is the central theme throughout the judgment. This position is light years away from reality. The position of the Antiquities Authority, as submitted to the Supreme Court, is an archaeological crime which is a pity. The authority has lost all moral and professional validity for its work. I mean, you couldn't get really a more damaging statement from the Israeli archaeologists on the site. So it's clear that the site has archaeological, scientific value, and religious value, and its importance is absolutely clear. The second issue that comes up both in the Supreme Court decision as well as today when we hear the Simon Wiesenthal Center talk is the claim of a failure by the Muslims and the Palestinians to protest what was happening. And of course, for large periods of this, they had a tremendous inability to protest, being as a mandate country or they were under the military occupation. So it made it very difficult. But despite that, you can just do some of them. Rashid probably knows this steps better than I. But in 1927, the Supreme Muslim Council declared it a historical site. The British government put it on the list of antiquities in 1944. The Muslim Waqf submitted it to UNESCO in 1948 before the mandate, before the final takeover. The Palestinians, when they built the parking lot, there's a picture we have, I think it's in the petition, of the Palestinian leaders, Muslim leaders, trying to gather the bones as they excavate or as they move land around for the parking lot. That's there, and they're trying to protest what's happening. And then in 1967, Muslim authorities asked permission to maintain the cemetery. The Israelis said no, and of course, the current Sharia court and the current Muslim protest. So it's clear to me that there was no failure to protest, although I'm not sure what difference that should make if you have a Muslim cemetery. And I think about other cemeteries. I think about the one we have down here for African Americans down in the federal court, and how as soon as there were bones found there were African Americans. What happened? The community rose up. The community, as they have done here, said this building shall not be put on the site. We want this site memorialized. You can go down there and see, not for all of it, because the bones stretch out under the old federal courthouse and everywhere else, but for a large portion, there is a memorial site to the African American cemetery that is there. So the failure to protest is not really there. There was a protest. And the third thing is, as Rashid mentioned, one of the instances, Israel recognized the site, and one of the actual language in 48 is, quote, Israel will always know to protect and respect this site. And then in 86, there was a protest again about building on the site. Israel said no project exists and its tombs are to be safeguarded. In 2002, Israel put it on the special antiquities list, as Rashid mentioned. So the site is clearly one that there's been protests against. It's clearly the site of the cemetery, and it's clearly one that has been protected over the years, at least in word. So we come to today in the petition, and what did we do and why did we do it? So as Rashid said, we lost it in the Supreme Court. We weren't the plaintiffs, which is an important point. We were not the plaintiffs, but we, as Rashid said, he decided once that case was over, because his ancestors were there, as well as other ancestors, 60-some ancestors of petitioners from 15 Palestinian families, we decided to go the route of the United Nations and the UN. And the UN has a way of, it has people called rapporteurs that are experts on things like discrimination, religion, racism, and they're experts in their fields, and you petition them to do an examination of this issue. They ask the country at issue to talk about what's going on, and they do an investigation if they want to and if they can, and then they report back on that, usually to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. The Human Rights Council at that point can issue resolutions. Those can go to the General Assembly, which can ultimately go to the Security Council. But the rapporteurs basically give a legal analysis of the petition and what the merits or the demerits are of the petition. And we decided to do that process in a very, very serious way throughout the world, really, and gathering up the plaintiffs who are the petitioners who have ancestors there, and to petition the UN, which we did in February. As I said, there's 60 petitioners from 15 countries. There's